Right after my alarm goes off in the morning, the first thing I do is I listen to the news summary from the evening before. And I remember once on the morning of May 6, 2015, I got some rather shocking news. The day before, there had been an election in Alberta, and the Progressive Conservative Party, which had been in power for 44 continuous years, lost the election to the NDP. Now, I don't really care about politics in Alberta so much. It's just that it had been so long since there had been any other party in power in Alberta, it just seemed like it was a permanent thing. My immediate response was to get up and run downstairs. I went to the fridge and looked at the bacon that I had planned to use for supper that evening because I wanted to make sure that it hadn't sprouted wings and flown away. Sometimes the things that we trust in, the things that feel permanent and unchanging, can change in the blink of an eye. Now, as much as a progressive conservative majority of 44 years could begin to feel like a permanent reality, imagine how much more the existence of the temple in Jerusalem would have felt like an unshakable reality in Jesus' day. The temple had been constructed by the returning exiles in the 6th century BC. And so by the time of Jesus, it had been around for a really long time. It was the premier symbol of Israel's religion and Israel's politics and Israel's culture. And so when the people look at the beautiful adornments, the temple was in the midst of a over 4-decade long, by this point, renovation project. They're like, wow, this is grand, this is amazing. Doesn't this say great things about our nation and our people? And Jesus, well, he sort of shares some really shocking news with the people. So read with me in Luke chapter 21, 5-19. Some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, "As for what you see here, the time will come when no stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down." "Teacher," they asked, "when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they're about to take place?" He replied, "Watch out that you are not deceived. For many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am he,' and the time is near. Do not follow them. When you hear of wars and uprisings, do not be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, famines, and pestilence in various places, and fearful events and great signs from heaven. But before all this, they will seize you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and put you in prison, and you will be brought before kings and governors, and all on account of my name. And so you will bear testimony to me. But make up in your mind not to worry beforehand how you will defend yourselves. For I will give you words and wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict. You will be betrayed by parents, brothers and sisters, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. Everyone will hate you because of me, but not a hair on your head will perish. Stand firm, and you will win life." Now, some modern biblical translations put a heading here that says that Jesus is talking about the end of the world, but scholars have pretty much all concluded that that's not what Jesus is talking about. He's not talking about something that has yet to happen. He's talking about something that will soon happen after the period when he's talking. He's talking about AD 30, and about 40 years later, in AD 70, the temple will be destroyed. Now, in the year 27 BC, Caesar Augustus won the war in Rome and ushered in a period that the historians call the Pax Romana, a period of relative peace and security in the Roman Empire. And so while there are the occasional uprisings and there's sort of tumult around in a little bit, it's been generally pretty calm for a long time. But Jesus says it's not going to always be that way. Now, the Pax Romana carried on for about 200 years. But if you were a Jew in Jerusalem, your experience of that would be anything but peaceful a few decades later. You see, there was a nationalist resentment building up against the Roman occupiers that boiled over in the 60s in a war between nation and nation, Israel and Rome. And that war culminates in the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple in AD 70. So Jesus is talking about that. And he's talking about what his disciples are going to go through, the persecution that's going to lead up to that. So what Jesus is trying to say, what shocks his followers, is that the temple is not a permanent thing. Because while you can trust in God, you can't trust ultimately in anything else. God instituted the temple, yes. But the temple had become an obstacle to the thing that God was doing. Israel was the incubator of this work that God wanted to do. But now it was time for that to go forward from the place of incubation to become a worldwide movement. And the temple was trying to keep the move of God from becoming inclusive and global. It wanted to keep it local and exclusive to the Jews only. And so, God does away with it. So Jesus is a scandal to the temple authorities because he comes and forgives sins apart from the temple. When the man is lowered down on a mat in front of him in Capernaum, and Jesus forgives his sins before he heals the man and walks away, he scandalizes the Pharisees and the people who are into the Jewish religious culture because a man can't forgive sins. That can only happen when a person goes to the temple and offers the prescribed sacrifices. And so Jesus places himself as a disruptor in the system. He basically says, no, God's doing something new here. He becomes the Netflix to their Blockbuster. And so they do what people tend to do in that situation. They try to destroy their rival. And so the authorities that represent the temple and its authority and prestige conjure up an excuse to kill Jesus, and so they put him to death. But Jesus is raised 3 days later. Describing that event earlier, Jesus says, destroy this temple, and I will raise it in 3 days. In other words, Jesus is showing that he is, in a sense, the temple. He's a metaphorical temple because he takes the place that the temple is taking. He's standing between God and people as the way that people receive forgiveness. But Jesus is eventually vindicated. 40 years later, the temple is destroyed. And the temple is still destroyed to this day. And so there are two competing visions for how a person comes to God and receives forgiveness. The one, destroyed, is raised up by God. The other, destroyed, is let to stay destroyed. And so the resurrection of Jesus is his vindication in God's eyes. Okay. So what does this experience with the temple mean for us today? How do we enter into this story? How do we fit into it? Well, just like the Jews, we can assume the permanence of the things that give us status, value, and identity. Just as historians dubbed the period in which Jesus lived as the Pax Romana, we live in a period that historians have dubbed the Pax Americana, in which the United States, our closest ally, has become the preeminent economic, military, and cultural power in the world. Now, for those of us who don't have memories reaching back to before the Second World War, it can feel like this has been a permanent reality when in fact it hasn't been one. And because it feels like it always has been, it feels like it always will be. But any serious student of history can look back and see that empires rise and empires fall. Sometimes it's in decades, sometimes in centuries, but it never lasts forever. And so if we seek to find our meaning and our safety and our identity in the power of this cultural moment and our alignment with it, we're going to be let down. It's not going to last. Now, maybe you don't care about all of that stuff. Maybe you find your meaning and your hope in things a little closer to home. Maybe you think your job is what gives you meaning and power and significance. It gives you a sense of purpose and a livelihood and the respect of people around you, but you can lose your job, and eventually you have to retire. Maybe it's in your youthful good looks. You're valuable because you're attractive to people. But as we all eventually find out, time may be a wonderful teacher, but it is a lousy beautician. Maybe you find meaning in your skills, but your skills may fail you or they may become less valuable over time. Maybe we look to other people or other things. Maybe we look to celebrities. They always disappoint us. Maybe we look to celebrity pastors. It seems they always disappoint us as well. Whenever we place our hope in something other than God, we are setting ourselves up for disappointment. So, we need to find our hope in God, and He will vindicate us. But Jesus warns us that while God will vindicate us, the road between now and then is not necessarily an easy road. We may encounter adversity, disappointment, hardship, suffering. Jesus trusts in the vindication of God, but He knows that between now and that vindication at the resurrection, He will have to walk through the crucifixion. And so it is with us. We trust in God's ultimate vindication, but we also follow Jesus on the way of the cross. Now, Jesus warns us about this potential suffering. And not because Jesus wants to be a downer, but because Jesus wants us to be ready. So that when we encounter opposition, when we encounter difficulty, we don't lose hope, believing that God has abandoned us. But rather, we understand that this was all a part of the plan. Now, of course, we might ask, why, if God loves us, does He allow us to walk through this as part of the plan? And I think it's because suffering can play a part in the work of God's kingdom. If you look at Jesus' original audience, the early church, they started as a small group of people centered in Jerusalem. And when the persecution broke out against the church, that's what caused the message to spread to Judea and to Samaria and to the ends of the earth. We have people like Paul preaching before governors like Felix and kings like Caesar. And so they spread the word about what Jesus has done. Now, in our own case, our responses to suffering can show the transforming work of God in our lives, but a little more on that later. So, we're supposed to hope in God. But what does that even look like? What does that mean in a practical sense? What does it mean to be more than just sloganeering? Well, I think it's a process of discipline. Now, before I delve into this, I need to make an admission here. I haven't arrived in this. I don't perfectly do this. And so if we're talking about how do we align our hope with God's expectation, all I can say is that I'm a learner here, and I can only share what little bit my experience teaches me. So I offer that with that disclaimer. So, how do we figure out? I think the first step probably must be to determine what my hope actually is. And so I think that the best way of doing that is that I can think of is the genie in a bottle thought experiment. If somebody were to give me a few wishes, what would I wish for? Maybe financial independence, maybe a sterling reputation, rock solid good health, happy and healthy children. None of these things are bad things. But if they are the thing that I hope in above all else, then those things will disappoint me. So, what am I supposed to hope in? Well, I think we see the answer to this in the Lord's Prayer. Jesus instructs us to pray, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And of course, practically speaking, what that looks like is Christ-likeness forming in us. Because Jesus is the one who does God's will perfectly. And so for us to pray that God's kingdom will be done on earth means that we lay down our will in order to pursue His agenda for us, just as Jesus did. But the thing is that we often prefer happiness and comfort to Christ-likeness because Christ-likeness often involves difficulty. We don't learn to love like Jesus loved by loving people who are lovable. We learn to love like Jesus loves by bearing with the annoying person, by giving grace to the person who fails, by forgiving the person who betrays us. We don't learn patience by getting what we want when we want it. We learn it by having to wait. We don't learn submission by getting our own way, but rather by having to lay down our own will and follow God's way instead. Christ-likeness doesn't happen without a disciplined effort to change our heart. But of course, it's not just about our own efforts, or we could save ourselves. It's also about the power of God. We can place ourselves in a position to receive from God, but ultimately it is a work that is only possible through His transforming power. So how do we put ourselves in a place to receive what the Spirit is doing? I think that we do this through prayer. In prayer, we ask us to help God to desire what is right. And then we choose to respond differently in the face of difficulty. So, for example, let's say that a person betrays me. My natural response might be one of self-pity. Oh, this is so unfair. Or of wrath. God, smite my enemy. But what if I allow God to do the transforming work of allowing me to respond with thanksgiving? Maybe my prayer might be, God, this is a difficult situation that I'm walking through right now. But I choose to thank you for it. Because my greatest desire should be that Christ's likeness would be formed in me. And I will only experience that wonderful blessing if I allow you to shape me. If I learn what it means to love the person who does not deserve my love because you loved me when I didn't deserve your love. And so, Lord, move my heart to compassion and to love for this person who has betrayed me so that I can learn what it is to be like you. Don't let me waste this experience by becoming embittered, but rather allow this experience to lead me to deeper and greater life in the power of Jesus. This sort of prayer and reflection is what can help realign our hopes, reminding us to hope in God and in nothing else. So in conclusion, while not everything will fail us in our lifetime, everything can. And in an eternal perspective, everything that is not God will fail. But Jesus challenges us to hope in God, trusting that if we do, He will lead us to our vindication and safely lead us through even the greatest trial, even through death itself. Because as Isaiah says, and as Paul later quotes, those who hope in Him will never be put to shame.